Hey, Brassfax here. Today we're going to be talking about the Primary Arms ACSS Holosun Red Dot. This is going to be less of a review and more talking about a design, I guess, because I've already reviewed this red dot. Everyone's reviewed this red dot, but only with its regular one dot or circle dot design. Thing's solid. It's got Holosun issues, but it's also $190. Doesn't work for passive aiming. The mount sucks. The design is decent. If you like it, swap the mount out. You guys know all of this. Today I'm going to be talking more about just the Holosun with the ACSS reticle and how that plays out. Does it work better than an LPVO? Who knows? Well, I know, but flow of the video, right? Dot plus magnifiers are pretty good for close, intermediate ranges. I like to call it the close range, no fail shot, kind of like a Chuck Pressburg thing, where you have to take a shot at like 100, 150 yards, but it's an incredibly small, low-profile shot. Magnification is almost mandatory for this kind of shooting, and, well, if you have a red dot with a magnifier, you have that magnification. Typically, however, where the red dot magnifier combo falls off is at longer ranges. Think 300 yards and beyond. While you could maybe get it done with your Battle Zero, 36, 50, whatever, yard zero, the nuance is kind of lost because there's going to be a lot of hold unders, hold overs, so on and so forth, instead of just simply holding over with a known drop, especially if you have a reticle designed for that, right? So unless you're very in tune with what your Battle Zero does at X ranges, right? Do I need to hold under here or over here, whatever? I actually find graduated reticles far more intuitive, right? This is nothing groundbreaking by any means. However, this red dot and others like it aim to tackle that. It's got stadia lines, well, dots, you know what I mean, up to 500 or so, depending on what your zero is. You have reference marks now that you can rapidly aim at known distances and to a degree unknown distances due to the rudimentary ranging features this reticle has. So now you don't have to hold an open space, which is very useful for first round hits, as well as holding for slight wind call. As soon as you add wind in with a red dot design, not only are you holding, above an open space, but you're now holding left or right, and it just makes it a lot more complicated. So you have an analog to, an LPVO, but instead of dialing down to 1x, you can instantly swap the magnifier out just by flipping it, and boom, you got a red dot up close, flip it, and you have a 4x, 3x, or I guess even now 5x design out far. But how does this actually play out in practice? Shooting out far, it's surprisingly good. I had a 200 yard zero. Yeah, I'll get into why in a second. I was able to hit steel from 100 to 500 yards in 100 yard increments quite easily from a 13.7 rifle. All first round hits except at 400, I whiffed the wind call and hit slightly to the right. The magnifier being used was the Holosun HM3X. Really good glass, some slight issues I'll get into eventually with that review. I brought out my 11.5 with the LCAN, and we shot them side by side out to 500. In short, they're basically the same. The only noticeable issue that could have been a thing was the wind holds, right? Because the LCAN has stadia lines, you get a little more functional wind holds, but in this day, I was able to park the aiming mark on the leftmost edge, and that was sufficient. If there was more wind, I'd be holding an open space, but it's somewhat understandable considering the design and purpose of a red dot with a magnifier versus an LPVO, so I would argue I wouldn't even want a more advanced reticle on my red dot, right? I don't want it too busy. This optic works really well if you want your red dot to go from a 100 to 300 yard gun to something that you can be confident out to 500 yards or maybe even beyond. So if I had to say, is this concept good? Yeah, I think this concept is super cool. Honestly, I was not sold going into this, and I thought, hey, I'd always want an LPV over this, but I could see it potentially being here. So this fulfills that niche. If you have a red dot, and you want magnification. So not just for that intermediate low percentage shot, but to kind of edge into that range where LPVO's working. We got that? Got it. Okay, I like it, right? We got it? I enjoy this optic. Let's engage nitpick mode. There are some downsides with this. The real issue actually came up close, and this gets more into the primary arms ACSS design and not graduated red dots in general. I think the chevron is, and this is going to piss some people off, the chevron was a terrible design choice here. Obviously, this is preference here, but that's what this YouTube channel is. It's my preference and what I've gained with my experience. If you think a single YouTube channel is out there just spitting raw facts and not their opinions and preferences, yeah, keep living your fantasy. But having tried the other graduated red dots on the market, I find the chevron is kind of a misstep. Let's take a step back. We look at something like an ACOG. ACOG is a fixed power, so the chevron functions as something more than a thin duplex that you can use as a flash sight picture up close, and you have some precision if needed for something like zeroing. And then for long range, it's a compromise. Most people will prefer something thinner when only shooting long range, but because we need that flash sight picture, it's something we can tolerate. The primary arms 2.5 to 10x that I recently reviewed, same story. On its 2.5x setting, the chevron is roughly the same size as it is here, because they're both technically first focal plane scopes, or red dot in this case. But it serves the same function as the ACOG does. We need more than just an intercepting duplex for close-in work. And then when we go out farther with the 2.5 GLX, we can just dial, right? And move the reticle away. The chevron here, however, manages to not be any value added whatsoever while bringing significant downsides. At distance, it has the exact same issues I have with the ACOG, while somehow being a smaller chevron, so even worse. It works when you're at the zero mark, right? So you're using the tip of the chevron, somewhat. But as soon as you begin to hold over, your target vanishes below the chevron, especially if it's a small target. And a lot of people shoot supersized, full-size targets, and it kinda works there. But as soon as the target gets any smaller than that, your target's gonna disappear below the chevron, and you're basically gonna have to kind of take the reticle off. Oh, it's right there, put it back on, and you're gonna be doing a little bit of guesswork. The issue, however, is most of the range is probably going to be about 300 yards and in, and all of that is obscured below the chevron. And that's where it really struggles. You just can't shoot really small targets with this thing because it's somewhere in that chevron is your hold. As soon as you clear 300 yards and you start using the dots, boom, things are good again, easy to aim with the little dots provided. So, like I said, other optics have chevrons, and it's obviously a compromise, and you can live with it, right? But my issue is not that this has the chevron and it's a compromise. My issue is that this brings nothing to the table. Like I said, with those other options, we have those for our lower magnification settings, right? It gets us that combat accuracy, and we're going to pay for it on the higher magnification settings. The issue here is when you flip the magnifier away, the chevron is also bad on 1x. So what was our point? What was the whole point of that? Functionally, this ends up as a giant oblong 6 MOA triangle thing. Yeah, it's a chevron, but every review I've seen that isn't Shill Central agrees. It's just functionally an oversized 6 MOA dot with some pointiness to it. You might argue that it's so big it draws your eye to it, right? You know, like a big LPVO reticle. But here's the thing. It's a red dot. The whole point was that we had a red dot at the end of the day, and not the complexity of a LPVO reticle that needs this bold etch bullshit to get our eyes to it. It's fluorescent, it's red, and we've been getting away with simply a single 2 MOA dot since basically the Stone Ages. This reticle already has a giant horseshoe for flash aiming. Why do I also need this giant 6 MOA chevron? I imagine it's primary arms preference in design, and I can respect that. But personally for me, I find it makes the reticle worse than it needs to be, both at 1x and at 3x, or whatever magnifier you end up using. So I honestly would have just preferred a dot, like everyone else on the market is doing with their graduated red dots. Since we're going pretty hard, let's keep it going.
The BDC is a little odd. I wish it stated somewhere what exactly this BDC is configured for, ammunition or velocity-wise. Some people think this is the chart that answers that. It is not. This is a suggestion. This over here is pretty close. I eventually just used Straylock, which had the reticle already implemented. If you put in some combos, you'll find nothing really truly lines up properly. I think in the effort of creating a universally okay reticle that works across a wide range of both 5.56 and other ammunition types, they created something that lines up for no ammunition types. Well, except a 40 grain projectile going 3,300 feet per second. That, for some reason, lines up really well. If I had to guess, it looks like the goal was M193 going roughly 3,100 feet per second, which kind of lines up decently well, but the numbers aren't very pretty. Is it usable? Yeah, sure. You'll need to know the hold slightly high, especially if you're shooting at something smaller than a man-sized. It's worth noting, you'll always sort of have to do some homework with the BDC because the chances of your BDC lining up with the original configuration parameters for that BDC is basically slim to none. There will always be a bit of tinkering. I'm just illustrating here that with a screaming hot setup, which is M193 at 3,100 feet per second, you're still flying short of the reticle. Even M193 out of a 20-inch barrel is not going to line up with this BDC properly. And speaking of which, most people are actually going to be slower if they're using 62 grain or just using something like 223. They're going to be well below 3,000, which is way off. Superset CA, the YouTube channel, had the same issue in their review. When they eventually just said screw it and went for a 200-yard zero, which is a variant of the 36-yard zero, and that ends up working okay, which is basically what I did. Got me to 500 yards just fine. Just worth noting how far off the seemingly the more convenient reticle choice versus the listed reticle design. Whatever, moving on.
Hitting up some other points. While the other Holosuns were not very good under night vision, this one is a bloody disaster. You probably want to turn off your horseshoe because the thing is just too bright, and even then the blob of lines, which is what it's going to appear like under night vision in a dark setting, just makes it awful. It's obviously got terrible transmission, as all Holosuns typically do, outside of the AEMS. This is kind of a bummer, because I think nowadays a lot of people are buying red dots because they want night vision performance. So, as an aside, more of a data point and less of a actionable thing. The battery life, if you turn off the auto on, auto off, the shake awake feature, and you crank the battery or the brightness setting all the way up to the top and then back it off one, which is a fairly bright setting, but I've talked about in the past how I find this useful for both overcoming a flashlight and just being a usable setting outdoors in a very brightly lit area. But if you put it on that setting and turn off the auto on, auto off, this is for testing, like why else would you? You will burn through the battery in about 1 month and a week. It doesn't last very long. Like I said, this is more of a data point to illustrate how much of that circle dot with all the stuff below it is gobbling up in terms of battery power. A regular Holosun like the 403, which doesn't have auto on off, will chug through its battery in well over a year. This obviously is munching it real fast. So just a data point, understand that if you have this in a car or something and you have it on a bright setting, you will go through your battery fast. I didn't really talk about the benefits or my thoughts on a magnifier with a red dot like this as an analog to an LPVO. I started doing that. I wrote the script. I even started talking about it, but it's going to take too long, and I'd rather just do a whole another separate video where I say, hey, how is the concept of red dot with a magnifier? Does that make sense, right? Do we want that, or should we just get an LPVO, right? I'll talk about that in a separate video because it'll just take too much time here.
So what's the conclusion here? What do you get from all this? Is this a bad red dot? Good red dot? Well, at the end of the day, it really depends on how you look at it. On one hand, it does seem to be one of the weaker options when you compare it to a SIG Romeo 4T or a EOTech EXPS 3-2 or something. Yeah, those seem to do the reticle just a little bit better. There's some added benefits like the night vision capability of the EOTech. That being said, the EOTech is, well, it's an EOTech, so you have the holographic tax or limitation, and it also costs close to $600 or more sometimes. The SIG Romeo 4T, well, That seems like a good option. It's got a slightly better reticle in my opinion, but that one also cost a lot more money, and at the end of the day, it's probably a Holosun OEM. I'm not 100% sure on it, but it does seem to be. So that does cost more, and you're actually not getting that much more when you think about it. So at the end of the day, well, yeah, I did have some gripes with the Holosun ACSS, but when you consider the options on the market for a red dot style thing with subtensions, it's actually one of the few options, and none of the options are really the perfect option, especially when you consider price. So in that vein, that's actually not too bad. It will really depend on the person if this makes sense to you or not, if the issues I mentioned will bug you or are something you can overcome, or you just don't care about these issues that I've mentioned and you jive with the setup. Totally understandable. So it'll really depend on the person if this makes sense to them or not. Hopefully the information I presented today kind of gives you my experience, which helps you, kind of decide if this would be good for you or not.
Anyways, hopefully you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys around.